I think it's quite fitting that the end of an era, which is 13 years and 19 days or something, but it comes to a conclusion tonight. And it's been a very long road, but there's no better place to conclude it than here in Sligo, as Brenda said, on the banks of the Garavogue River. The whole project, whilst I heard about it as a child, it played around in my mind over many years, and sometime thereafter I got word that Captain Cuhan, his brother was John Cuhan, the newsagent in Castle Street. But the real instigating factor that led me to tell this story was I was doing family research in the Sligo Champion in 2011, and I stumbled on the front page of a newspaper, and they were looking at me was none other than a full story of Christy McCran leading the mountain rescue squad up to the wreckage of the St. Kevin on the very night that it happened. And something just really grabbed my attention there then. In fact, it's not an exaggeration to say that I got the hairs on the back of my neck standing, but it just took me over there and then. And as I came across the little walk bridge there at the Fiddler's Creek, I was making my way to Michael Cuhan's shop, the newsagents, to tell the nephew of the captain about this Christy McCran phenomena. And of course, both of us were in shock. But from there I knew I had a story. But what I have to completely admit is at that point I had no clue that it was a phenomenal intergovernmental cover-up. Nor did I even know that the plane was still in the bog with the people in it and the suitcases and wings and engines. And that is the way to this day. That seems to be the thing that irks people, is that the entire plane is still in the bog, bar the tail plane of the actual plane. And over the next few months I started to do research, but of course there was nothing on it. And eventually I tracked down a man in town here, and he was a nephew of Christy McCran, and I asked him, is Christy alive? And he said, no, Christy was deceased, and that was the end of that. But a few months later, I was out on a road at Knocknarea, Rathcarra car park called the High Bray. And this lady engaged me, and we just started chatting on the side of the road, and the name McCran came up, and it turned out that she directed me to Father McCran down in Ransborough. And of course, he turned out to be Christy McCran's nephew. And not only was he his nephew, he was named after him. And furthermore, Christy McCran was alive and well in Doncaster in England. So from there, connections were made, and I went to see Christy McCran, who was extremely reluctant to see me. In fact, on the phone, he told me he didn't know a thing about it, and he just tried to fob me off. I guess in his 90s, he didn't want the hassle of it. But eventually, he did see me, and I went to Doncaster, and not only did it have a profound effect on his life, he even had photographs of it, and some of them are displayed in volume 3 here. And he was just a magical find. And from there, things really started to snowball. People started coming out of the woodwork, and people started contacting me. But one of the most phenomenal coincidences, then I started encountering all these coincidences that just kept leading me to keep the journey going. And one phenomenal coincidence I encountered was I was in a Barnes and Noble store. They're a very large book chain in the USA. And my wife at the time was a manageress in the store, but each of these stores has a little cafe, and they make the most beautiful tea. And I came back from Ireland, and I was having a cup of tea one evening, and this young girl is making me my tea, and I said to her, please don't stew my tea. And she said, I wouldn't dream of stewing an Irishman's tea. And I said to her, why did you say that to me? And she said, because my mother's Irish, and I'm sure, as you all know, when somebody claims to be Irish, it's generally one of the great-grandparents. But I said, how Irish is your mum? And she said, my mother's full Irish, born and bred. And it turned out her mother was a lady called one of the McDaniels here. In fact, it's the first house in Abbeyville they came from. And so this phenomenal connection was made, and I mentioned that her aunt, that she would have an aunt who's married to a McCran man, who's here tonight, who's a nephew of Christy. And at this point, everyone in the store was gathering around at this coincidence that this girl was in this tiny cafe, whose mother came from my hometown, who I actually knew. I knew her mother as a young teenager. And I turned around and I said to my wife and everyone there, I said, there's no such thing as a coincidence in my life that's not a St. Kevin coincidence. And with that, people were looking at me like, what's he coming out with? And I said to the little girl, her name was Caitlin, I said, Caitlin, you have an uncle in St. Joseph's Terrace in Sligo. and his name is Sean McCran, and his uncle was Christy McCran. So basically it became a classic concept of this little girl who I thought was stewing me my tea. Her uncle's uncle led the mountain rescue squad up to the crash site. So, and I just kept encountering all these absolutely bizarre coincidences, and there was just no end to them in sight. I want to talk about somebody who is very, very special to me in this project, and I have the permission to say these words, by the way, from her sister. A very eccentric lady who lived out at Kellystown, a brilliantly clever lady called Patricia Handley, and some of you here met Patricia with me. And Patricia's father was the captain on the St. Kieran, which crashed in 1953 in Birmingham, but thankfully everybody survived it. But he was blamed by the same investigator who blamed Captain Cuhan. And I was told by Michael Cuhan, the nephew of Captain Cuhan, that this lady lived out at Kellystown, and it took me a while to track her down, but I did track her down. And twice a day, if the tide was high, you could not get to her because the water was in. She lived down the very, very end of Kellystown, and I formed a great friendship with her, but she was as eccentric as be damned, but she was also brilliantly clever. And I used to go out to her once and twice a week, and we'd bring briquettes and biscuits, or I'd bring them, we'd chat away, and she had all these hundreds of Aer Lingus files where she had spent her whole life literally trying to clear her father's name. And unbeknownst to her, because they were not of any material relevance to her, she had documents on the St. Kevin crash. And one day I was bringing her down for her annual appointment in the Galway Clinic, and on the way back we got chatting about one of the St. Kevin passengers who died, a man called John Benson, and she matter-of-factly just said to me, I was at John's funeral. And I said to her, no, Patricia, I've been going to your house for a year, you've never told me this. You never asked me, she said. And it turned out she had been at John Benson's funeral with her father, because her father was then Captain Tommy Handley, the president of IALPA, in 52, 53. And from there, I brought her back to my mother's house, and I started showing her pictures of John Benson, and she started naming everybody in the pictures, including her own sister, who was one of the pictures. So this was going from the bizarre to the bizarre. So one particular day I was in her house, and she had this incredible document. She had quite a few incredible documents, but one of them wasn't. It's in volume 3, and it's OT 291, and it was penned by an Aer Lingus captain called Captain Joe Barrett. And before I tell you this, I have permission to tell this from her family. And I said to her, Patricia, I said, I would give anything to reproduce this document in my St. Kevin investigation. And she said, she used to sing a lot, and she'd say, toodly-hoo, I'll have to ask Jimmy. And I said, who's Jimmy? And she said, Jimmy is the man you're writing the book about. And I said to her, I looked her straight in the eye, and I said, do you have that ability to ask Jimmy? And she said, I don't, but someone in England does, a friend of mine. And I said, well, can we bring that person right away? I didn't care how I got the document, I just wanted the document. And she said, no, it doesn't work that way. So I started to ring around. On the second, third call, she said, don't ever ask me about that document again. When Jimmy is ready to give it to you, you'll give it, you'll get it. So I continued to go out to her twice a week with the briquettes and the Mikado biscuits, and I'd try and sweeten her and get any files I could out of her. And then one day, about 3 weeks later, she phoned me out of the blue and she said, Jimmy came through here to have the document, and you can have all the documents. And she had an Aladdin's cave of documents, and many of them are reproduced here. And some of them show how the British government carved out in February 1951, the National Airways, which was a direct predicatory factor to the St. Kevin crashing, because Aer Lingus continued to take the direct route, which was the shortcut, because the British government didn't feel it was worthy of putting beacons in on this shortcut. So basically Aer Lingus were saving 10 minutes in time, thousands of pounds a year in gasoline, but there was a small risk involved. Now, to close out the Patricia Handley coincidence, I showed this OT 291 document to a barrister who lost his brother on the crash. And he said to me, that's a fantastic document. He said, but can you get something that will corroborate it? And I went back to Patricia and I said, Patricia, I appreciate that these people are probably deceased, Captain Barrett and First Officer Brian Noble, and Donna Lamont was the radio officer. But I said, have any of them got children? And she said to me, I don't, they're all deceased, she said. And she said, but I was at Captain Barrett's funeral. And I said, well, when? And she said, I don't know. And I said, well, was it 100 years ago? Was it 5 years ago? And she said, it was probably 15 years ago. And I said, did you meet any of his children at the funeral? And she said, actually, I met a son of his at the funeral. And I said, please, Patricia, because anything before 2012, you're not going to get an online obituary. And I said, please, Patricia, think. And she said, when I was consoling with his son, it came up in conversation that I was living in Sligo, and he told me he was in Sligo. I said, where? And she said, somewhere out towards Ross's Point. So I left Patricia there and then, and I went down to the Marrydyke, and I started on the first house, and my goal was to go to the last house in Ross's Point and come back in. But it didn't take long. Within 3 or 4 calls, I was standing in front of Gordon Barrett, son of Joe Barrett, and everything just fell into place with that particular document. So I've just had all of these coincidences happen, and they're very pertinent to me because I'm from Sligo, and they're all connected into people that are also from Sligo. So that was Patricia Hanley, and I would just like to say, if she's looking down on us, I loved Patricia with all my heart. She was a very, very special person, and she dedicated her whole life to trying to overturn her father's injustice, which was that there was icing in his fuel. And I will say one thing about Patricia, and I have seen the evidence of this. I don't know if any of you are into civilian airline crashes, but when the British Air was 777, the first in the world, crashed in Heathrow in January 2008, Patricia Hanley immediately penned 5 identical letters and registered them to Rolls-Royce, the engine manufacturer, Boeing, the airplane manufacturer, the AAIB, which is the British government's investigative panel, British Airways themselves, and Captain Burkle of that flight. Now, Captain Burkle wrote back to her, and he told her that he was precluded from speaking of anything that might in any way hinder the inquiry. Some smartass in the AAIB wrote back to her and said to her, you cannot compare a piston engine aircraft from 1953 to a state-of-the-art jetliner of the Boeing 777. And she wrote back to him, physics in 1953 is identical to physics in 2008. And after the British government spent $250 million sterling, or $400 million on the investigation into that crash, it came back with exactly what Patricia Hanley had put in writing to them: icing and fuel. Now, the reason I know that Patricia did this, like, it's very easy to make up documents after the fact, but Patricia also sent me the documents that she got back, including Captain Burkle, who wrote to her and profusely thanked, after saying he was precluded. When the investigation then came out that it was icing and fuel, he wrote to her and he thanked her profusely and said if she was ever in England to look him up, and vice versa. If he was in Ireland, he'd look her up. So you can see Patricia Hanley has been worth her weight in gold to me. Aer Lingus's chief air hostess, or they were called stewardesses then, was a lady called Anna Greevy. Her sister was the famous operatic singer Bernadette Greevy. But Anna selected Deirdre Sutton to go on the flight that night, and she lived her whole life out in guilt. She got on her knees every night and said a prayer to Deirdre Sutton and begged her for forgiveness. It turned out that Anna met an undertaker called Bunny France and married him. And I tracked them down because it turns out that my grandfather had sent one of his sons to do his undertaker training with this Bunny France. So another connection opened up. But in the 2 or 3 times that I interviewed Bunny France and his wife, one particular day we were finished yapping away, and I said, have you got any unusual undertaking stories? And he said to me, yeah, he said, I've got a really good one, he said. And he went on to tell me that there was an Italian man drowned in World War II, torpedoed and drowned, and how the son of that man had come into his office and said, my mother's dying wish was to have my father exhumed from an island off the coast of Ireland and brought and put into Pancras Cemetery and buried with my mother. And the Bunny France said to him, that's a very, very tall order. And he said, well, see, is it this tall? And he put down some money. In any event, Bunny France is explaining this to me, and he eventually gets the body back. And I stopped him as he was telling the story, and I showed him a photograph of the sailor who was exhumed on Tory Island. I showed him his grave or his headstone, and he got into a very bizarre state. He just kept saying to me, you cannot know this, you can't have this photo. Well, I said, I don't know it, but I do have the photo. I said, I have the family tree, and I'm taking a chance that, because when we were children in 1975, we all got the half day off school to see my grandfather getting in a helicopter to go to Tory Island to exhume the body. It turned out it was one and the same body. So just another phenomenal coincidence that just leaves you feeling, where's all this going? This story is told in volume 1, by the way, and it's again on the subject of a very unusual undertaking story. I was in a house in Long Beach, Long Island, and this lady lost her father, Tom Carroll, in the crash. And the last time she had seen him, she was 12 years of age, and he gave her a kiss on the cheek and said, see you next month. And of course, he came across the Atlantic safe, but he died on the St. Kevin on an internal European trip to Britain and back. And I was in her house in 2002, and she got in an awful state when she heard me inadvertently say to someone else that her father's body was still in the plane. And she made me promise her there and then that if she ever made it to Europe, that I'd take her to the crash site. And I gave her my word I would, and I never thought she would. But 3 years later, she turned up, and we got to the crash site. I missed very difficult terrain, but I got her to the crash site. And as we crossed out on the mountain plateau, which if any of you have been there, you'll know the bowl. And as we came out on the bowl of the mountain, she said to me, she said, Gavin, I think you're wrong. She said, in fact, she said, I know you're wrong. I was at my father's funeral. And I said, Maureen, you weren't at your father's funeral. And she said, I was at my father's funeral. And she got this memory on the mountaintop. So we agreed to disagree there and then. Of course, I was convinced I was right. She was convinced she was right. So eventually she went back to America 2 days later, and she asked her brother, surely I can't have imagined that, and her brother told her that, yes, she was at her father's funeral, but there was nothing in the coffin. Her mother had did it because of her young age, and because he had a string of bars in New York City, she wanted to give him a good send-off so that all the clientele and all the suppliers in the industry would come. So they had a fully fledged funeral with nothing there. And it was primarily done for the daughter. So the next thing I had to set out doing was to find who this rogue undertaker was. And I assembled a listing of hundreds and hundreds of New York City undertakers. And I started ringing each of them and giving them the same line. I'm from an undertaking family. Unusual stories do get carried on. Please, please, you remember this. And I started leaving my phone number with all these people. And about 4 days later, I get a phone call back, and it's a girl who tells me, I know exactly what you're talking about. It was my grandfather bought the firm, and it was the people before them bought them. And from there I ended up getting photographs of the original funeral home and the memorial card, etc. So, and that firm is still in existence in the Bronx. It's called Quirollos, Q-U-I-R-O-L-O-S. I have to tell a bizarre story of, and I've had this happen a few times, but a bizarre story of a man on the St. Kevin was called Gerald Townley Fitzgerald. And I tracked down that he had a nephew, but the nephew had since moved house. And I called to the house that he was at, or that he had lived at. And the lady there knew nothing about him and said, no, I never met him. And we bought the house, but we bought it through the normal methods. We bought it through an estate agent, and I never met the man. I don't even know who or what he is. My husband and I just bought it through normal channels. And I just got this crazy idea, and I just said to her, you know, did his mail ever build up? Did it ever come to it? You know, did you ever have to drive around with his mail? And she smiled at me and she said, actually I did. And I said, well, can you remember where you drove to? And she said, not a hope. And I said to her, if I phone you and I put you on speaker mode, my mother was with me and my mother holds the phone, do you think I could get into your subconscious in some way and we could find where you went with that mail? And she said, no. I said, what have you to lose? I said, you are the only one on planet Earth that can get me to this man. And his name was Simon Butler. Her name was Katharina. And she said, okay, if you want to try it. So I went out of the street and I took a right, and then I'd start calling her landmarks. And all of a sudden her memory started to come around, even though this event had happened years earlier. And eventually I'd take a left turn and I'd say it's a dead end. She said, no, come back. And her mind started to come alive. And she said to me at one point, when you find the house, she said, there's greenery on the left-hand side. So we kept going, go forward, go back. I see a red chimney. No. Eventually, anyway, I end up on a little street turn, and there's all this green bank. And I said to her, I'm at a green bank now. And she said, hop out and tell me the street name. And I hopped out and I said, it's Dartry View. That's it. But I don't know the house, she said. So, but it's one of those. So I quickly surmised that most people know anyone who lives two doors either side. So I thought if I hit 3, 8, 13, 18, 23, I'll find out where Simon Butler lives. So I went to number 3, there was nobody there. So instead of going to 4 in case breaking the 2 rule, he doesn't know who 1 is, I go back to number 2. And a little old lady answered the door to me. And her name was Cecily Barry. And she said to me, no, she said, listen, my son has gone out for a while and my short-term memory is not the best. Will you write down what you want? So I wrote down my name, my number. I'm looking for Simon Butler, who was a nephew of Gerald Townley Fitzgerald, killed in an air crash, 52. And as I walked away from her, she shouted after me, I know somebody killed in an air crash. And I thought, because she was a little old quintessential lady, I said I'd walk back to her. And I went back expecting, you know, it was someone crop dusting in New Zealand, her first cousin 4 times removed or something, because civilian air crash deaths are almost non-existent. And I went back to her and she said to me, you won't know her, she said, because it's way before your time. My first cousin was the first air hostess killed in an Aer Lingus crash. So I said to my mother, I said to her, excuse me, I said, when I go to tell this story, I said, nobody's going to believe it. Can I bring my mother in to witness it? And I got mother in, and she made us fine tea made us tea in her fine china. And it turned out that she watched the funeral cortege of Deirdre Sutton. They had a shop in Sandford in Dublin, and she watched it overhead and described it in detail to me. And then we parted our ways. We spent about an hour with her. Of course, I was mad to get back down to Cannies to have a few beers. I completely forgot the person I was really looking for. So I came back to Sligo, had a few beers, was flabbergasted that I'd got a bigger fish than I went looking for. And the next morning I got a call from this woman's son. And he says, I'm looking to speak to Gavin Walsh. I said, you're speaking to him? And he said, thanks for making the connection. Simon Butler is the first house she called to number 3. My mother's day-to-day memory's gone. Of course she knows it, but she didn't know to tell you. And we've lived next door for so many years and we're connected into this same air crash. So what you had was a nephew and a cousin of the air hostess. So I've had hundreds of those kind of things happen to me, and it's almost like the story has attached itself to me, and it keeps teasing me for the next what's around the corner. And it's got to the point where nothing of it surprises me, and I mean that very genuinely, absolutely nothing. And the last one of those stories I have, and I cannot explain any of these to you. I honestly don't mind if you don't believe them. The only words I can use for them are they're inexplicable, unexplainable, but they all work out. They all produce results. I was asleep one night in bed. And I'm going to number form it here, 2:22 a.m. 09/06, the 9th of June 2015. And I got this vivid dream on how to track down the commercial manager of Aer Lingus of 1952, who was a man called Max Stuart Shaw. And I was interested in Max Stuart Shaw because when the coffins came back, including Evelyn Belton, when the 5 coffins came back from the following Tuesday, Max Stuart Shaw was in attendance at RAF Valley RAF base, and he didn't want the coffins on their own, and he put up his hand and he said, I'll go with them. And of course an ATC man in Dublin called Dara, he said, I'll go with him. But in any event, Max Stuart Shaw was of good character and came back on the flight with these coffins. So I was desperate to get his photo. But of course, by the law of averages, age-wise, he was well gone. But I got this dream, and I put the dream in place, and the next Sunday, I called to 9 Seymour Square in Brighton in South England, and answered the door to me, and I said, excuse me, I'm not looking for you, the man I'm looking for is probably dead, but I said, it's 9 Seymour Square, and he said to me, you're from Aer Lingus? I said, no, but you're pretty close, I'm up here about Aer Lingus. I said, why would you say that to me? Well, he said, you're evidently looking for Max Stuart Shaw when you know he's dead. You're at the right address, but you're at the wrong house, he said. And he said, Max was a great friend of mine. Now he said, tell me what you want. I said, I need to speak to anyone belonging to Max till I get a photo of him. I want to hear his stories. And he said, well, his wife is still alive and she's 97. And he said, she lives in 9 Seymour Square. And he said, if you hadn't used your sat-nav, you'd have gone to her address instead of my address. So I said, do you know this lady? He said, I know her very well. She was a socialite in the 1940s and 50s. She's now 97, so he calls her and she says, tell him give me 15 minutes. And he puts his hand over and he says she's putting on her face. So anyway, he walks me down the back of his drive and he walks me into this plush area, and it's a beautiful tower block overlooking the sea, and she buzzes me in and I go up in the elevator, and there's somebody with me, by the way, a friend of mine, Sue Oxtoby is with me. And this lady meets us out of the elevator. This widow of Max Stuart Shaw meets us out of the elevator. And she takes me in and she tells me that Gareth Fitzgerald, that our Prime Minister, Gareth Fitzgerald, gave a 40-minute eulogy at her husband's funeral, which, by the way, was true. And that her husband, Gareth Fitzgerald, said that he'd have been nothing. Well, he wouldn't have been the Prime Minister of Ireland only for her husband, because he took him under his wing in Aer Lingus in the 1940s. And then she proceeded to question me in detail as to what I knew and why was I there. And I said, I'm here because Max did something very honourable. She said, is that the Aer Lingus crash that nobody knows about? I said, it is. She said, it upset Max greatly, and I've heard the story. She knew all about it. And then out of the blue, she turned around and she said to me, and again, I'm not putting this on any of you. I don't expect you to believe it. It's my experience. She turned around and she said to me, and the lady, Sue, who was beside me, she witnessed this, and she said, as cool as anything, she said to me, did my Max send you to me? I said, he did last Tuesday night. She said, I wish he'd stop doing that. And in any event, I got the photographs that I was after, and they're in volume 3 here. And that's been my Saint Kevin. That's a fraction. I've told you 5 stories out of, I think I've had over about 1,000. I've catalogued all of these because a lady way back in the early days, a lady called Barbara Marion Horn, predicted to me that I was going to encounter all these phenomenal coincidences. So I've catalogued them all, thankfully, and it's great to share some of them here, what you hear tonight, and maybe someday they'll be the next book. But right now, I'm happy to say that in my opinion, and I believe the fact that the AAIB, which is the Air Accident Investigation Branch in Britain, came back to me with a recusal letter, I'm happy to say that we have unequivocally cleared the name of Captain James Richard Jimmy Cuhan, that he was never where they put him. He was travelling in a northeast direction, not a westerly direction. They put him 20.5 miles off course, and they did it for reasons of litigation, not to have to pay out money, and it's that simple. And I'm very happy that Volume 3 categorically tears their investigation apart. They did come back to me in March with a recusal letter, but at no point did they address any of my 236 pages, which means we won. Well done.
3 books.
Yes, yes.
Can you just give us a brief outline of what's in the 3?
Well, the structure of the books came to me as I went along, because I'm a one-man band and it took 13 years and whatever else. What I did was initially I'd break down the biography. They're not just books about the air crash, they're books of the lives of the people. And each book contains several biographies. But in the first book I show the predicatory factors that built up to the air crash. Pardon me, I show the entire history of that particular DC-3. That's very specific model. 16699 was the MSN number, and I even tracked down the people who riveted it. So I go through everything into it. In volume 2, I tried to set out a circumstantial case as to what befell the St. Kevin by detailing what we actually know befell a sister aircraft called the St. Conan, which was travelling 26 minutes behind it. And in volume 3, and volume 3 took the longest of all, that's why it's so goddamn big. But the first 56 pages show the dire straits Aer Lingus were in financially, and that is the real reason that the investigation and the inquiry had to go the way they wanted it to. And I've said this before and I'll say it again. Had the inquiry gone against Aer Lingus would have gone bankrupt. There is no question of that. It's happened to TWA, Pan Am, ValueJet, any amount of them. If an airline is in financial difficulty, one accident will knock it to the ground. And Aer Lingus were in ferocious financial difficulty at that point. They were losing money year in, year out. And the Conservative Party in Britain wanted rid of Aer Lingus because, I forgot to say, the British government owned 40% of it. The Irish government couldn't afford to keep these losses up on their own. The newspapers of the day were calling for the airline to be either shut or losses to be stemmed, but they couldn't stem the losses. And one of the ways they stemmed these losses was to cut the 3 to 2 man crews, and that is one of the causal factors that led to the loss of the St. Kevin. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
A long, detailed answer as usual, but anyway.
Gavin,
yes, Trev.
You've been down in my sitting room more times than I can remember chatting about this. And some of the coincidences you told me about were absolutely unbelievable.
Yeah.
So I wonder if there's any chance you could go into 1 or 2 more of those. And then the second thing I want to ask is, although you're very logical, science-minded, do you feel, given the absolute unbelievable amount of coincidences, that you were meant to do this? Being a science-minded person and all that, we're slightly going to...
Okay.
You can answer first.
Well, I'll answer it this way, because there's a few things here I didn't bother going into, because one, I'm bloody sweating. But anyway... 12 years ago, I had no belief in anything. I lived for myself. I lived for rock and roll records, being this, having this collection, having that. I travelled the world several times record collecting. I flew Concorde, Zero G. I lived for material things. I had several properties, and then I lost everything. And when I say I lost everything, I don't just mean in the context of houses and stuff like that are all replaceable. I mean, over the years I sold off a collection. If you owned what's in that book today, you'd be a multimillionaire. And over the years, and I didn't, unlike houses and borrowings on businesses that you generally would owe money on, I didn't owe anything on my collection of stuff. But I have found an internal happiness, a contentment, and I've been battling cancer over the last 12, 13 years, and I have found an internal contentment that I have never experienced like in my life before, and that comes from this project. And I cannot get away from it. Like people say to me, how do you keep going? I don't know how I keep going. I cannot get, if something has gripped me, and I hadn't planned to say this, but I will now say it. When I first met my wife, we were going to San Diego, and she caught me looking at car registration plates. And she said to me, what are you doing? And I quickly, of course, pretended I was doing nothing. She said, no, you're doing this all the time. What are you doing? And I said, I don't know. And I'll give you an analogy of it, because I have thought about this over the past few days, and I would only really feel comfortable about saying this in my own hometown. If you think of chewing gum in your mouth, my mind absorbs numbers and works on them unbeknownst to me and then throws them back at me. And sometimes, some people call it a form of Asperger, others call it a form of Tourette's, whatever. And there's sometimes I will be in company and I will blurt out things that I've learned how to stop it. And people will say, did she just look that up on a smartphone? Well, I don't have a smartphone for starters. And my goal is to go to my grave without a smartphone, by the way. But this story almost fitted like a glove to a hand, whatever insane in the membrane is going on in here. And it has completely taken over every cell in my entire body. And I cannot stop till I got it to the end. And by the way, I think we're at the end. I'd like to think we're at the end tonight, and we'll bring the next phase on and try and get the point overturned. But to answer your question, Tabby, yeah, there is something has changed my view of things. And you know, I'll just tell you a very interesting story. The Christmas 8 years ago, I was visiting an aunt of mine in Wisconsin, Catherine. And I was driving her down to Burnie, and Madison is the state capital, and Burnie lives west of Milwaukee, and they're an hour apart. And my aunt, of course, couldn't get herself ready. You know, I need another hour or two. And I said, look, it was the last Saturday before Christmas. In other words, it was the busiest shopping day of the year. And I said to my aunt Catherine, I said, why don't I go to Barnes & Noble? We're back to Barnes & Noble again with the cafes and the great tea. I said, why don't I go there, work on St. Kevin, see you 2 hours. She said, okay, that's fine. So I went to Barnes & Noble, got myself tea, got myself set up. The place was packed. I mean, even just to go through an aisle, you're weaving through people because everyone's looking at books, and it's part of a shopping mall. So I'm going to be as clean as I can with this, by the way. So eventually the 2 hours come to an end, and I have to go to the loo. And the doors in the Barnes & Noble is like, it's like a tailor-made, they're all the same, they're like a shoe print, they're huge stores, they're like as big as Dunn stores, and all they are is books. And they only go into big cities. But this one was on the east side of Madison, Wisconsin. So I go to the loo, and there's 2 stalls in the loo. And excuse me, ladies, here now, but I'm not going to go graphic, but there's 2 stalls in the loo. And there's somebody in the first one, so I go in the second one, which is the wheelchair one. Now, because it's the wheelchair one, it's wider. And the reason I'm telling you that is that, and I have no business looking at someone else, but I can see the guy next to me, his feet, but he can't see me because he's in a tight stall. Now, I'm telling you that for a reason. It's going to come up in the next few seconds. So we're both sitting down, we don't even acknowledge each other, and the next thing, the main door opens into the overall bathroom, or restroom as they call it. And all I hear is a child scream, "Daddy, Daddy, come out quick." Now, I did not hear what she said, but I did see what her husband did, and it was out of this world. "Oh, shit," he bellowed. And he got the toilet roll. And again, because of my viewpoint, I'm looking over because the whole wall that separates us is rattling. And he got the loo roll, and he's gone out the door. So the whole thing, from her shouting, "Daddy, Daddy," to him gone out the door, is no more than 4 or 5 seconds. And I immediately thought she must have said, "Mother had a fall." But I had no clue. All I heard was, "Daddy, Daddy," and I heard him, "Oh, shit," he bellowed, and gone. So I went about my business, took my time, washed my hands, came out. And what I came out to was an empty store, books all over the floor, chairs everywhere. 0 people, nobody. Just nobody there. And I'm starting to look around, and I think, did North Korea come up with a neutron bomb that sucks people, and how was I not sucked off the toilet bowl? But the place is in complete disarray, but there's not one human being in sight. And I'm not putting this on any of you. I don't care if you don't believe it. This is my experience. I got the inner St. Kevin thing. You're all good. It's all good. Don't worry about it. I didn't worry. I would be the first one. If I had known what had happened, I would have been out the door in front of that guy. In any event, I'm still looking around looking for clues. I know something terrible has happened, but I have no clue because I heard nothing. And all I hear then is on the overhead, "Could the man in the back, could the man walking in the back aisle drop the bag, drop the bag." It's my laptop. And my laptop has the 23 children in it that I never had, which is the St. Kevinites, and I'm not going to leave my laptop down. "Put the bag down, drop the bag," and I can't see who's shouting this at me. "Put your hands over your head." So I put the bag down, and the next thing they start shouting, "Where'd you come out of?" I said, "The restroom." And I was brought into a big storeroom, and what it was, when they build these buildings, because they get very different kind of weather systems in the USA, they build them with very strong doors. So I was basically brought into a lock room. And when I got in there, it was full of people. And everyone had their smartphones out. And because smartphones were only that new, and they're all watching on television, a whole CNN crew, Fox News, they're all outside. There's been a mass shooting. So what the child had roared in at her father was, "Daddy, Daddy, come quick, there's been a shooting." And for some reason I didn't hear the word shooting, so I just thought it was something personal. So I, of course, then ring Ella, my wife, down, and she's working in Barnes & Noble, in the same Barnes & Noble that Sean McCrann's niece is in. And I ring her and I said, I'm caught up in a mass shooting here in a Barnes & Noble. Get the hell out. Now, Barnes & Noble had 777 stores nationwide, and they never had a mass shooting. And then they're all putting it on their phones down in Louisiana. Oh my God, he's inside in that. And that's just more of the crazy stuff I've been through. And maybe my luck is going to run out tonight, but I will say this, that I have been guided, nurtured and protected by something not of this earth to get this story told. Whether that stops tonight, I don't mind, the story is out. But all these coincidences, and I've only given you 5 or 6 of them, I've had over 1,000 of them. There is just no explanation. And I would genuinely love to sit down with somebody who has the academic brain and go through the odds and the probability of all of these unfolding. And what are the odds on? Because I will assure you they're off the Richter scale. They're billions or trillions to one. And they just never stopped till I got everything I needed. That's it. And I should also say that I have 2 work spots in Ireland. One of them is in Cahany's bar in the corner, and the other is down in the corner right here. So I feel especially at home telling this story for a couple of reasons. That's one of my main work spots. Christy McCrann, you could throw a stone up to his house in Garavogue, and I was told about the story when we were living in a masonette in Dory Park.
Not alone, well done, very well done.
Thank you.
There are lots of coincidences, and I'm not going to go into them. I ended up, for some reason, my father had a business in Sligo, I was in Ballina, and my father decided to retire. So we needed to live somewhere closer to Sligo. We were living out in Mayo at the time. So came to Easky, and my next door neighbour was Captain Hanley. And but Captain Hanley had a hidden talent. He was one of the best players of squash that I've ever come across. He taught the Connacht team, but he also taught me. And he was doing that into his 60s. But he was an amazing character, but that's another story. I just want to say to Gavin how grateful I am for all the work he's done. And plus, I knew my Uncle Jimmy when he was alive.
You met him? You met Jimmy?
Yeah, he used to come to Sligo with his brother Mossy to meet my father. There were 3 Corkmen together. My father always said he needed to meet them now and again to get his wit sharpened. And they were great fun. But I remember saying to Uncle Jimmy once, I said, "What was the most interesting thing you ever did during the war?" Now, he had ended up at the end of the war. He did an RAF programme every Saturday night on the BBC, recording what had gone on with the Battle of Britain and things like that, which he fought in. He flew Spitfires in the Battle of Britain, and then he flew Mosquitoes towards the end of the war, and he flew them for the SAS, the Special Forces. And he said to me, the most interesting thing I ever did was, he said, I picked up a man from one of the RAF bases in the south of England. I had to fly him to the south of France. The war was still on. France was still occupied. And I had to drop him above the snow line in a parachute. And he had a ticket to get to a train down in a village about 17 miles away. And he said, I found out after the war he had made it. But these were the things that they did and that he did, which, you know, never came out. But he was a great character. Again, well done.
Thank you, Michael. Just to say, Michael was an early inspiration to me, and I had many a chat with him back in the days as we started it off. So, okay. Do you want to speak?
Yeah.
I think on behalf of those who've actually lost people in that air accident, my father was killed before I was born, and the work that Gavin has done, the 13 years of actually hard work, you know, the story of what actually happened would not be known. And we owe him enormous gratitude. And I would like you all to give a real round of applause. Robin, from the bottom of my heart, thank you.
Thank you, Bill. And I would like to finish up on I actually had these words for finishing up. When Christy McCran was asked, would he do it again? But this was on the front page of the Sligo Champion on the 19th of January, the week after the crash. I don't know who the editor was back then, but he asked Christy, would you do it again? And Christy was, by the way, the fittest man in the RAF. They put him in to do any of the country championships. He won everything. He was unbeatable. And Christy's answer was extremely succinct and poignant. I would rather run up and down Ben Bulben 20 times a day than to do that job again. But it had to be done, and I had to do it. And now I'm going to paraphrase Christy McCran. I was given a story that had to be told. I had to do it, and it's done. Okay.